What happened when the camera was fixed? The situation has often been described. In the first place, the frame is defined by a unique and frontal point of view, which is that of the spectator on an invariable set. There is therefore no communication of mutually referring variable sets. In the second place, the shot is a uniquely spatial determination, indicating a slice of space at a particular distance from the camera, from close-up to long shot. Immobile sections movement is therefore not extracted for itself and remains attached to elements, characters and things which serve as its moving body or vehicle. Finally, the whole is identical to the set in depth, such that the moving body goes through it in passing from one spatial shot /plan, to another, from one parallel slice to another, each having its independence or its focus. There is therefore neither change nor duration, properly speaking, inasmuch as duration implies a completely different conception of depth, which mixes up and dislocates parallel zones instead of superimposing them. We can therefore define a primitive state of the cinema where the image is in movement rather than being movement image. It was at this primitive state that the Bergsonian critique was directed. But if we ask how the movement image is constituted, or how movement is extracted from persons and things, we see that it is in two different forms, and in both cases imperceptibly. On the one hand, of course, through the mobility of the camera, the shot becoming mobile itself, but on the other by montage, that is, by the continuous connecting of shots, each one, or the majority of which, could perfectly well remain fixed. This method allows the achievement of a pure mobility extracted from the movements of characters, with very little camera movement. Indeed, this was the most common practice, and notably was still used by Murnau in Faust, the mobile camera being reserved for exceptional scenes or remarkable movements. Now, at the outset these two methods were in some sense obliged to conceal themselves. Not only had the connections of montage to be imperceptible, for example, connections along the axis, but also the camera movements, insofar as they concerned ordinary moments or banal scenes, movements which are so slow as to be close to the threshold of perception. The two forms or means only intervened to realize a potential contained in the fixed primitive image, that is in movement when it was still attached to people or things. This movement was already characteristic of the cinema, and demanded a kind of emancipation, incapable of being satisfied within the limits set by the primitive conditions, so that the so-called primitive image, the image in movement, was defined less by its state than by its tendency. The spatial and fixed shot tended to produce a pure movement image, a tendency which imperceptibly came to be acted out by the mobilization of the camera in space, or by montage in time of mobile or simply fixed shots. As Bergson says, although he had not seen its application to cinema, things are never defined by their primitive state, but by the tendency concealed in this state. The word shot can be reserved for fixed spatial determinations, slices of space or distances in relation to the camera. This is the way Jean Maiteri defined it, not only when he condemned the expression sequence shot, which according to him was incomprehensible, but with more justification, when he saw the tracking shot not as a shot but as a sequence of shots. It is then the sequence of shots which inherits the movement and the duration. But since this is not an adequately determinate notion, it is necessary to create more precise concepts to identify the unities of movement and duration. We see this in Christian Metz's syntagms and Raymond Bellauer's segments. But from our point of view for the moment, the notion of shot, Plan J has sufficient unity and extension if it is given its full projective, perspectival or temporal sense. In fact, a unity is always that of an act which includes as such a multiplicity of passive or acted elements. Shots, as immobile spatial determinations, are perfectly capable of being, in this sense, the multiplicity which corresponds to the unity of the shot, as mobile section or temporal perspective. The unity will vary according to the multiplicity that it contains, but will be no less the unity of this correlative multiplicity. We can distinguish several cases here. In the first case, the continuous movement of the camera which defines the shot, whatever the changes of angle and of multiple points of view, for example, a tracking shot. In a second case, the continuity of connection constitutes the unity of the shot, although this unity has as its content two or more successive shots which can moreover be fixed. Mobile shots can also owe their distinction to material constraints alone, and form a perfect unity as a function of the nature of their connection. Thus in Orson Welles, the two high-angle shots of Citizen Kane where the camera literally goes through a window pane and penetrates into the interior of a great room, sometimes by means of the rain which crashes against the window pane and mists it up, sometimes by means of the storm and of a clap of thunder which breaks it. In a third case, we are confronted with a long-duration fixed or mobile shot, a sequence shot, with depths of field. Such a shot includes within itself all the slices of space at once, from close-up to long-distance shot, but nevertheless has a unity which permits it to be defined as a shot. Depth is no longer conceived, in the manner of the primitive cinema, as a superimposition of parallel slices each of which is self-sufficient, all of them merely traversed by a single moving body. On the contrary, in Renoir or in Welles, the set of movements is distributed in depth in such a way as to establish liaisons, actions and reactions, which never develop one beside the other, in a single shot, but are spaced out at different distances, and from one shot to the next. The unity of the shot is produced here by the direct liaison between elements caught in the multiplicity of superimposed shots which can no longer be separated. The relationship of near and distant parts produces the unity. The same evolution appears in the history of painting between the 16th and the 17th centuries, a superimposition of planes each of which is occupied by a specific scene and where characters meet side by side is replaced by a completely different vision of depth, where characters meet obliquely and summon each other from one plane to the other, where the elements of a plane act and react on the elements of another plane, where no form, no color is restricted to a single plane, where the dimensions of the foreground are abnormally enlarged in order to enter directly into relationship with the background by an abrupt reduction in sizes. In a fourth case, the sequence shot, for it has many types, no longer involves any depth, nor superimposition, nor drawing back. On the contrary, it brings all the spatial shots back to a single foreshot, avant plan, which passes through different frames, in such a way that the unity of the shot refers back to the perfect plainness, plenitude, of the image, whilst the correlative multiplicity is that of reframings. This was true for Dreyer in his sequence shots which were analogous to uniform tints, aplats, renouncing all distinction between different spatial planes, plans, making movement pass through a series of reframings which are substituted for change of shot, plan, audit, Gertrude. Images without depth or with little depth form a type of flowing and sliding shot, which is opposed to the volume of deep images. In all these senses, the shot indeed has a unity. It is a unity of movement, and it embraces a correlative multiplicity which does not contradict it. At the very most it can be said that this unity is caught between two demands, of the whole whose change it expresses throughout the film, of the parts whose displacements within each set and from one set to another it determines. Pasolini has expressed this dual requirement very clearly. On the one hand, the cinematographic whole would be one single analytic sequence shot, by rights unlimited, theoretically continuous. On the other, the parts of the film would in fact be discontinuous, dispersed, disseminated shots, without any assignable link. Therefore the whole must renounce its ideality, and become the synthetic whole of the film which is realized in the montage of the parts, and, conversely, the parts must be selected, coordinated, enter into connections and liaisons which, through montage, reconstitute the virtual sequence shot or the analytic whole of the cinema. But there is no such division between the shot in fact and the shot as it ought, by right, to be, which leads to Pasolini's great aversion to the sequence shot, which is always maintained in virtuality. There are two aspects which are equally of fact and right and which manifest the tension of the shot as unity. On the one hand, the parts and their sets enter into relative continuities, by imperceptible connections, by camera movements, by sequence shots of fact, with or without depth of field. But there will always be breaks and ruptures, which show clearly enough that the whole is not here, even if continuity is re-established afterwards. The whole intervenes elsewhere and in another order, as that which prevents sets from closing in on themselves or on each other, that which testifies to an opening which is irreducible to continuities as well as to their ruptures. It appears in the dimension of a duration which changes and never ceases to change. It appears in false continuities, faux raccords, as an essential pole of the cinema. False continuities can come into play in a set, Eisenstein, or in the passage from one set to another, between two sequence shots, Dreyer. This is indeed why the sequence shot does not merely interiorize montage in the shooting, on the contrary, it poses specific problems of montage. In a conversation on montage, Narbonne, Sylvie Pierre and Rivette ask, where did Gertrude happen, where did Dreyer make it happen? And the answer that they give is, it happened in the splicing. False continuity is neither a connection of continuity, nor a rupture or a discontinuity in the connection. False continuity is in its own right a dimension of the open, which escapes sets and their parts. It realizes the other power of the out of field, this elsewhere or this empty zone, this white on white which is impossible to film. Gertrude happened in what Dreyer called the fourth dimension. Far from breaking up the whole, false continuities are the act of the whole mark that they impress on sets and their parts, just as true continuities represent the opposite tendency, that of the parts and the sets to rejoin a whole which escapes them.